on the U.S. China Relations overview page of the U.S. State Department, every instance of the People's Republic of China was changed to just China. And the wording in the introduction became more assertive. For example, it states that, quote, the U.S. works to deter China's aggression, combat China's unfair trade policies, counter China's malicious cyber activity, end China's global trafficking of fentanyl precursors, mitigate China's manipulation of international organizations, and promote accountability for China's violations of human rights within China and around the globe. The website also mentions the CCP 3 times, an unprecedented move compared to previous versions. I want to stay on Wen-ti because Wen-ti's on record as saying that you believe that Washington is trying to reassure Beijing with these changes that the US does not challenge CCP rule. Why do you say that?
I think there's a meaningful decision here between the China fact sheet on U.S. State Department's website in terms of how they talk about relations between China and CCP. And there's a division between how they talk about CCP in international sense and the domestic sense. The international sense, yes, there are more numerous mention of the word CCP, Chinese Communist Party, in terms of how CCP may be pursuing economic coercion, may be pursuing cyber maneuver, other gray zone maneuvers that's disruptive or instability inducing. That's the part where it seems to be tougher in terms of Washington towards Beijing. But that's international. If you look about the bit where they talk about China's domestic situation, you see every mention of the phrase CCP getting replaced with the word China. If you're at Beijing, you think about this change on my domestic front. That seems to suggest to Beijing that, well, Washington seems to be not trying to challenge my regime security anymore. Maybe there's a sense that, at least on a domestic level, there is some kind of, if not acceptance, then acknowledgement or acquiescence that CCP, Chinese Communist Party, is going to be a default ruling party, the default polity that Washington will be working with. If that's a reading, then that will be also in line with the statement we see from the Biden administration as well, which is the so-called 5 no's. That U.S. pledges to Beijing, that U.S. has no intention of starting a new Cold War with Beijing, but most importantly, that U.S. does not seek to challenge the regime security of the current ruling forces in China. That is the Communist Party.
Essentially what they're saying is that the CCP equals China.
That's how one would read it if I were Beijing and trying to be optimistic about this. And that would be the part that's reassuring to Beijing. And Beijing would be like, yes, everything else internationally you can criticize, but on the thing most matter to me, my regime security, you are saying to me that you keep your hands off.
Ian, you're reading.
So there's no sort of definitive talk about how we should read this. So not to contradict what Wen-ti had said, there's another view which says, okay, well, previously the talk about the reference to the PRC as opposed to China was done in such a way to say, okay, any differences that Washington has with Beijing, it's really about policies of the PRC state. It doesn't have a problem with the Chinese people writ large. And that also speaks to some of the concerns that people had, especially during COVID, where there was very little distinction between people, ethnicity, state by the Trump administration. And so that worried people who were ethnically Chinese who were elsewhere, also in the United States. So that distinction had that assuring effect on another sort of separate group of people. Now, the sort of read you can take by sort of removing the PRC, I think for people who are concerned about the sort of blurring of ethnicity and polity and all that, could be that, okay, so maybe given the sort of more right-wing leanings of the Trump administration, they are maybe seeing the world in racial terms again. So that could create a degree of concern. So the whole point of me raising this is that there are multiple, again, interpretations that people debate about. This whole lack of clarity suggests, that communication between Washington and Beijing and how it's being read, really creates a lot more room for uncertainty and speculation than, I think, assurance at this point.
Okay. Now, China's ambassador to Australia wrote in January that the international consensus on Beijing's One China principle is unshakable and the trend towards its control over Taiwan is unstoppable. The Economist has reported a so-called diplomatic coup by China to get 70 countries around the world to support all efforts by Beijing to achieve unification with Taiwan, marked here in red on the map. All means would include military force. Most of these countries adopted the stance within the past 18 months following China's diplomatic push toward the global south. Now, additionally, Lowy Institute finds that 89 countries, nearly half of the UN member states, support Beijing's efforts to, quote, achieve that national reunification, so-called reunification. It says, crucially, they have done so without specifying that these efforts should be peaceful, arguably consenting to Beijing using force to take control of Taiwan. So, if I could stay on you, Ian, this time for this question. So this was what you were saying, that you thought the changes were more in response to this campaign of Beijing. How dangerous is this for Taiwan?
So it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag because the PRC is trying to build legitimacy behind its case for controlling Taiwan. It is trying to, I guess, get into a situation where you have the United Nations and most of its members agree with its position. Yes, you might get that in the General Assembly, but the General Assembly doesn't decide who belongs to what or who controls what. So it might get a rhetorical victory. Whether that translates into actual control of Taiwan is a different story. And the other...
Who does get to control, by the way?
Who gets to control is essentially who, is on the territory and is able to decide, where it goes. That's ultimately, it's as you possess, or use possitatis, as people in international law might call it. So that, the sort of actual physical presence is what really matters. And the other point why I say it's a mixed bag is it's because it's not clear how much these other countries really, feel for Beijing's position. For them, Taiwan is far away. They don't think it matters to them in a direct manner. So if you're getting some sort of benefit for just some words, sure, why not? If push comes to shove and you have to actually put up some costs, will the wording change? I don't know, it could. And lastly, that Beijing's push for perhaps getting more UN member states to support its position, ironically, as the US is perhaps weakening and hollowing out the United Nations, okay, so you have a body that says something, but how much force does it actually carry in practice? That is also a question that remains unresolved.